Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Tamara Thorpe, and I am the host for our mentoring podcast on Making Connections, a handbook for effective formal mentoring programs in academia. I am really excited to be here today with David Law. David Law is not only one of the editors for our handbook on effective mentoring, but he's also a contributor to another chapter, as well as to the chapter we're going to focus on today, chapter 9, which is looking at and emphasizing recruiting, selecting, and matching in mentoring programs. And I'm really excited to dive into that conversation. But I want to tell you a little bit about David Law, because he is a human development and family studies professor at Utah State University, and he serves as the associate director of the USU Uinta Basin campus. And so he has a degree in psychology from USU, a master's degree in family and therapy from the University of Wisconsin-Stout, and his PhD in MFT from Brigham Young University. And he is published in marriage and family therapy, family life education, and the scholarship of teaching and learning and mentoring in academia. He's been the guest editor for the online journal of Family Science Review, and he's received multiple awards for mentoring undergraduate students. And just most recently in 2021 was recognized as the Emma Eccles Jones College of Education and Human Resources our Human Services Undergraduate Faculty Mentor of the Year. So we are incredibly great hands. So hello, Dave, and welcome.
Hey, thank you, Tamara. It's great to be with you, and I look forward to this opportunity to collaborate with you on this podcast.
Absolutely. So one of the things we want to talk about that is so key to a mentoring program is the process of recruiting, selecting, and matching mentees and mentors. And I know that this is one of those processes that lots of people really struggle with. And, there's lots of folks like me and others who are creating sort of technology to help facilitate this process. But let's kind of strip it back from the practical pieces a little bit. And because you really emphasize in this chapter that it is really important to begin with the end in mind. So when it comes to recruiting, selecting, and matching mentors and mentees, what exactly does that mean to begin with the end in mind?
Yeah, well, thank you, Tamara. I think it's important to understand how interconnected all of these different chapters are in this book, and you may be surprised to kind of think about, well, why is recruiting and selecting and matching, why does that have to, why should that be connected to the needs assessment in chapter 5 or the theoretical framework in chapter 2? And too oftentimes when people are charged, and I'm going to select program coordinators in particular, when they're charged to develop a mentoring program, and especially if it's their first go around of doing something like this, they may not appreciate how interconnected all of these ideas are. So let me just give you an example. Let's say that you are developing a program for undergraduate students, and are you looking to help students who are in the sciences get into medical school? Are you looking, is the intent of your program to look at undeclared students who may be more at risk of dropping out of the university? And so as you kind of think through that, that should be very much informed by your needs assessment and looking at the data that, support the program that you're trying to do. And so depending on what your purpose is, so it's really important to think, what is my purpose? What is the overall purpose or the overall goal of this mentoring program? Because as you think through that, and if you're looking at, let's say, a sense of belonging, and you know that how important that is for a non-declared student to feel like they're a part of the university, and we describe that in some of the case studies. We also describe sense of belonging in one of the case studies there at the University of New Mexico when they were looking at underrepresented faculty members in the process of their promotion and tenure. And so depending on what's the purpose is, that's going to impact the theoretical framework that you use. It's going to impact the operational definition that you end up. And you might be surprised to think, well, it also impacts the recruitment and the selection. For example, if you're looking at undergraduate students who are trying to get into medical school, let's say in the sciences, you're probably really going to try to look for mentors who have a rich, maybe research agenda and lab experience. And so those might be the folks who you try to recruit into your program. And maybe the social side or the psychosocial support of mentoring, maybe that's not as critical for these groups or these groups of students who want to do the research, get the lab experience, and get into a medical school. Whereas let's take a student who, let's say the purpose of your program tomorrow is to look at students who are undeclared. And here at Utah State University, as we were developing our program, as we looked at the data in ours, and we looked at risk factors, race, gender, first generation, non-declared student, we found that there was not any really difference in those groups other than the undeclared student. They were at really high risk for not completing their university studies in our statewide campus system. And so as we looked at this, and as we start thinking about our mentors and who we want in the program, we really want these mentors who are really high communicators, available, empathic, great listeners. And so that's kind of why I think tomorrow that it's important that you begin with kind of the end in mind to try to connect all these different ideas and eventually how they impact your recruiting and your selection and your matching.
Yeah, thanks for that. I appreciate that, because I think that is one of the themes that we see throughout the book, that a lot of the authors have pointed out how critical it is to have the end in mind, because that's going to inform so many aspects of those early stages of program development that include recruiting, selecting, and matching. And I certainly know in my world, when I'm talking with clients, one of their biggest concerns or fears is, how are we going to recruit, select, and match? And so many struggle with recruitment alone. And I believe that my experience has been that mentors are much easier to find than mentees. But that has been my experience, because I believe that people love to mentor and love to sort of help the next group of people come up behind them. So when we're thinking about recruitment, particularly within the context of higher education or academia, what do you think is an important or critical elements to consider when thinking about recruitment?
Yeah, great question, Tamara. And let me tell you, we're having I would say that your experience of recruiting mentors is easier than the mentees. And I think as I've talked to other program directors, and listened to their presentations, like at the Mentoring Institute, I would say that's pretty typical. And we're certainly experiencing that in our local program as well. And so I think as you look at recruiting tomorrow, I think it's very important to try to take a step back and look at the overall university culture. And in chapter 6 of the book, we talk a lot about the culture, the institutional culture, and one of the recommendations that we end up making at the end is about culture, and we'll talk more about that with Nora in the editor section. But so what I mean by university culture is it begins in things like the recruiting process of a faculty member. For faculty that come into the institution. It begins in student orientation for incoming freshmen. For graduate students, it's part of the application process of applying and trying to get into their desired programs. For staff members, it begins with the application process and the interview process. So sprinkled within all of those elements are the opportunity to start recruiting. And so let me just take a faculty position, for example. Very in the application, in the job description of that, there's a great opportunity for a department head supported by an academic dean to emphasize the mentoring culture that we are trying to create at this particular university. And so spelling that out in the job description, what that looks like, mentoring outside of the class, mentoring outside of the classroom, the opportunity to peer mentor your colleagues. So that can be embedded in the job description, let's say for a staff or a faculty member. For orientation, most universities have some type of orientation set up where it's a very natural way to start recruiting and getting that word out that we have these different programs. They're formal. They have some great data that supports them. And so that is a very nice beginning in the recruitment process. And then in the interview process, again, for a faculty member, make it part of the interview process. Talk to them and that can be some of the interview questions. Tell me what kind of ideas you have to mentor students outside of the classroom. What have you done in the past? What have you seen that works in the universities that you've been associated with? So I think those are opportunities to begin the recruitment process, and then Tamara, I'm going to break these into kind of our case study section, our undergraduates, graduate students, staff, and faculty. Let's say you're working on a program for undergraduate students. Things that we found that really help is personal contact. And I can't emphasize that enough. This personal one-on-one communication with a student about this program, about this opportunity. My experience is, we do things like here at Utah State University, we have some excellent flyers. We work with our marketing department to develop these testimonials of the program. And we have those testimonials playing, in the different rooms and cafeterias and on Canvas. Our local medium for how we manage classes at Utah State is with Canvas. We have announcements that come across the students' Canvas page. One of our ways that we one of our methodologies of delivery is called interactive video conferencing, where students across the state of Utah will come together in pockets, and their instructor might be located at a different center. And then while they're sitting in their room waiting for class to start, we have these announcements coming across the screen that say, hey, are you interested in, have you ever considered the mentoring program? For faculty, we encourage faculty who are part of the program to put it in their syllabus and to place it where their students can see it. And it's really interesting because for our local program, it's available to our statewide students, but not our students in our main campus in Logan. And so we get students that are taking the class and go, hey, well, how come this isn't offered here? But it starts conversations, right? And we say, well, maybe talk to your department head and see if there's opportunities to do something like this within your department. And we're always available to consult and promote as we can. And so those are opportunities to recruit. We do, I think activities are really important, Tamara. And one of the things we do in the fall is kind of this welcome back kickoff. We make it a fun barbecue, different booths, different community partners, but we always have a mentoring booth there. And that's where we go to try to get these students. But I mentioned at the beginning of the selection process, the personal contact, the most effective thing that we do, and I think this works for students, staff, faculty, and graduate students. We do a calling campaign where anybody that's new into our system gets assigned a faculty member to be called by them. And that faculty member calls them and tries to get a hold of them on the phone, not email, not text. We do send out emails, we do send out texts, but that's before and saying, hey, we're going to call you. And it's so interesting, Tamara, because the typical response is, oh, I heard about this, but I didn't really know if it was for me. And so now this gives you an opportunity to explain to them what it is, because I think so many emails and texts, they're simply jumped over and bypassed. We've had this. I'm going to now go to faculty and staff tomorrow. One of our, we use faculty meetings to recruit faculty from. We use conferences to recruit faculty and staff from. But one of the most effective is when each one of our centers has kind of a person in charge at that particular center. We ask them to go one-on-one with their faculty members, and especially these new faculty members that are new and they're wide-eyed and they're like eager to help out, and explain to them, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing this. So I would say in all of these things, all those things I've described in the selection process are good, Tamara, but there's nothing that ever substitutes that personal contact, that opportunity to converse and to have questions directed to you to kind of tell more about the program in a more intimate way than a text or an email. So,
well, and I don't want to miss something important that you said, because I think as folks read through the book, they're gonna discover a couple of things. One of the things I think they're going to discover is that Utah State University is a real exemplar when it comes to building out a scalable mentoring program. And I think that they're also going to see that one of the reasons that's been possible is because of what you said of building mentoring into the culture. And I know we have a chapter that focuses on that and a case study that focuses on that, and the podcasts for that are great. But I think that that's such an important point to reinforce, because all of those activities that you just identified, the personal contact, the partnership with your marketing department for promotion, access to faculty, that can only happen when that culture of mentoring is built into the organization. If that buy-in doesn't exist at the highest levels and it's not fully embedded into the culture of organization where mentoring is just recognized as a best practice or a practice we have, then those tactical things that you just mentioned become quite difficult.
Yeah, yes, yes. So a lot of these things take people's time. They take people's energy, and you end up, there's a cost. There's a cost to all of this, and related to the cost. The one thing I love about a mentoring culture is if the mentoring culture is established, mentoring's always going to be there. And program coordinators, they don't need to be looking over their shoulder like, is my program going to get axed because maybe we're not being as effective as we should be. They should always try to make it the most effective they can, but the attitude should be, this is a work in progress. This is part of our mentoring culture. All of us have been in university settings where we have faculty or students who would not make good mentors, but over time, you want to try to change that so that it just becomes part of the culture, part of the expectation, and you have to have that buy-in from upper administration, just as you said.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's so key, and I love that the book covers that, and I love that it's demonstrated so well. So and I want for folks who are listening who are thinking, oh shoot, right, I'm just trying to get something off the ground, that it isn't, you can start, but also keeping that, starting a mentoring program can be the beginning of embedding the mentoring into the culture of an organization. And you've shared with us different ways in which we can recruit. But one of the things that you did say was that, a good mentor has certain skills, certain qualities, certain amount of availability. So what are the characteristics of a good mentor that we want to keep in mind in selection processes?
Yeah, yes, and it cuts both ways. Not only are there skills that we look for in a mentor, but there's also dispositions that we want in a mentee. And so I think in the mentee, and again, Tamara, this is really important that you understand the purpose of your program. And let me tell you let me give you a really concrete example. We're right now in our program here at USU, we're having the issue that you said, not enough mentees and more mentors. And one of the challenges that we're having is that some mentees will sign up for the program and then they're not accessible to their mentor. When their mentor reaches out to them through an email or a text or a phone call, they don't respond. And so that's very frustrating for the mentor. And we do a monthly survey where we gauge, hey, how'd your meeting go? And how long did you meet? And those kind of assessments. And these mentors are getting this, are like, I feel like I'm not doing a very good job because you're asking me, but I'm trying. And so one of the things that we've debated, and we're actually debating it right now, our committee that's working on this, is how much skin in the game should you expect from a mentee? And so I think this goes back to that question of purpose. And so our primary purpose, we're looking at probably the most vulnerable population in our student body. And so these are usually folks, first generation folks, likely may not have the kind of family support that other students have. They're in college and probably feel like they're an imposter in the system. And so to ask them to fill out an application and to say, tell me what your goals are for this mentoring program. Where do you see yourself in 3 years? What kind of careers do you aspire because of your particular field of study? That's probably too much of a leap for this group that we're looking at. But it might not be too much of a leap for other types of programs where maybe you already have this pool of highly dedicated students that are looking to get into some type of field that's very competitive, and it may be very appropriate in that setting. And so that's one of the things you have to consider. And that's why I want to tie it back into that purpose. You have to be very, very clear. So as a committee, we kind of are going down and kind of citing that we don't want there to be a lot of barriers. And our hope is, even though it's frustrating some of our mentors, our hope is that once they can get connected and start meeting with their mentor, they'll become more and more comfortable. And these kinds of issues are exactly what we want to address because of the mentoring program. So I just want to say, as you look at the mentee, just you be thoughtful. And your question, Tamara, I wouldn't want a new program director that's listening to this podcast be going, holy cow, there's so much to consider, which there is. But I'm going to chime in from Bob Garvey, the author of Chapter 1, The Lifeful Human Being. He attended a presentation down about the book down at University of New Mexico Mentoring Institute in October, and somebody asked me that question, and then I overheard him talking to this person after the class, and he said, "Let me tell you, you want to start small. Start small. Start easy. Just take one bite of that elephant." And I think that's very wise of Bob, and so even though we're talking about a lot of these ideas that they should consider, do what's doable and just start. That's how you get started with this mentoring culture. So as far as the mentee, I think what you want to look at is Dion does a wonderful job about this in her chapter, and this kind of that willingness and that being humble and being teachable. I think those are really some of those skills of just being kind of a sponge and being willing to kind of put yourself out there. Now the challenge with that, Tamara, is as you think through this, those are hard things to assess, right? They're hard to kind of give some pre-assessment and say, we're going to do these assessments, and then the people that score highest we're going to let in the mentoring program. Now you could do that, but I think you would do a disservice to a lot of people. But those are generally the characteristics, and then on the mentor side, they become much more easily identified. I'll just tell you what you don't want is you don't want a narcissistic personality that is unavailable to students. And I'd emphasize this. I've seen other authors emphasize this. It's worse to have a bad mentoring experience than it is not to have any than compared to no mentoring experience. And so you want and this is where I think program coordinators can do a wonderful job of, as they're recruiting faculty, staff, maybe peers, if they don't know the mentor, start, just kind of what's their general reputation. And I think just a lovely thing is to just kind of think about, when you see a faculty, do you see them with students? Do you see students in their office? I mean, if you see a faculty member and you see that they have students in their office, that is that person has the qualities. So empathy is a huge quality. Being able to put themselves in the student's shoes, being able to understand perspective. Interpersonal communication, being able to talk clearly to people, to express, and no, tomorrow I go back, and this wasn't part of my plan, but as we're talking about it, it's organic. I love this. I was at this attendance at this conference, and they were talking about dyadic relationships. And I'm a marriage and family therapist by training. Okay, so I love the field of relationships and how people get along and how people connect and all that. I've always enjoyed that. So anything related to that perks my ears up. But he said, when you look at dyadic relationships, and that's what, if you look at the traditional one-on-one mentoring relationship, in the book we talk about one-on-one, but we talk about many other typologies. But if you look at that traditional one and you think, how do two people develop a relationship? And there's really two key factors there. The first one is when their interaction creates a positive emotion in the mentee. So it might be support, it might be curiosity, it might be laughter, it might be humor. So when there's that positive emotion, and if the mentee feels like the mentor supports them, if they feel supported by them, they start that's how a friendship or a mentoring relationship, that's the beginning of that. So you want these mentors who are individually aware enough to know how to do that. And when they know how to do that, then they can have these amazing conversations. Now, I'm not saying training that training can't help, because it can help, and training is very critical, and people can learn these skills. But you want to look at some of these skills, hopefully they already bring to the table, that you and then if you're program coordinator, that's where the selection you may have the opportunity, if you have more mentors and mentees, you may put the ones that don't have these skills kind of like, let's wait and see, and maybe next year, but let's get these ones that are really good at interpersonal and intrapersonal skills. Let's get them on board, setting goals, creating this relationship, and helping this person start to acclimate to the university and feel like they're an important member. So those are some ideas to consider for selection.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think you said a few important things. I don't want to get lost, because I certainly think that there are some core skill sets that are critical for our mentees that you outline in your chapter and others do around empathy and listening. And one of the things you said that I think for folks to keep in mind is, you can find mentors among the folks who are already mentoring, right? That sometimes there's faculty or people within your organization who are already, in very often serendipitous or informal ways, already mentoring. And those are folks that are going to be motivated and have experience and practice and desire. And so to keep an eye out for those folks who are already building those relationships, that's such a rich pool to draw from when we're thinking about where we can recruit and select mentors from. And I think you honed in on something really interesting about mentees, because I think we want to make mentoring programs accessible. So whether someone is a student in a university context or early career talent coming into an organization for the very first time, having someone tell you need help can be very intimidating, and it can feel like, if I say I need help, what's that gonna mean? And if you're asking me questions like, what are my goals, what do I accomplish, maybe I don't even know yet.
You're right.
Right? Maybe that's why I need a mentor, to be able to answer the questions to get into the mentoring program. So we certainly want to be thinking about what's accessible, because if you're a, freshman, sophomore student, or somebody who's just joined a huge corporation for your first job, and you're getting asked questions that you think you might not even know for at least a couple of years. That could be a real barrier to entry.
Yes, yes. And I would say, piggybacking on what you said, Tamara, one of the experiences that we've learned is that both mentor and mentee, this needs to be all volunteer.
Yeah.
And when you get into the adult education and how important self-directed learning is, all volunteer.
Yeah.
And people should be there because they want to be there, not
Yeah.
because they feel forced to. So
Yeah.
yes. And you mentioned the word accessible, and I didn't mention that in one of the characteristics of a mentor, but that is, just being available is
Yeah.
really important.
Yeah. So then that brings us to the complex task of matching. And so, there are folks like me who get very excited about simplifying that and building some algorithms around that. And then there's certainly times where good old fashioned spreadsheet or, photos, cards, but there's regardless of the modality or the methodology, what are things that we need to consider when matching?
Yes, and I think I I think I think it's really important, Tamara, to try to put yourself in the mentee's shoes. So it might be an undergraduate student, it might be a faculty member, it might be a new staff member, and to think about, okay, who would they be most comfortable with? So that's a good place to start, is who would they be most comfortable with? And so as you look at that kind of comfort level, um, there's certainly research that supports the more similar the mentee is to the mentor, the more comfortable that mentee is going to be. So similarities might be race, it might be gender, sexual orientation, geographic location, first generation. Um, so so it's always good to be aware of that and to be cognizant of that. And as you look at algorithms, as you look at good old-fashioned spreadsheets, those are things that you should consider. But Tamara, the challenge of that is, let's say we were trying to match on race, and let's say we had an African American student that was in the mentoring pool, and let's say let's say not a student. Let's make it even a little more complicated. Let's say a African American new faculty member, and we want to match them with an African American tenured faculty member at their university. So, first question, are there enough African American mentors at that university to fulfill that role? There may be, there may not be. But even if there are, and even if people are willing to do this, Tamara, you have to be thoughtful about overloading them. You can quickly overload a mentor, and especially if the mentor is, has all of these positives. A lot of times mentors that have these wonderful positive personality skills, they also can spread themselves thin, because and I think that's kind of part of that altruistic personality that kind of goes hand in hand with these skills. And so you have to be aware of that. A department head should be aware of that.
Yeah.
And
I
as they
think that's
look at this, go ahead.
I want to say, I think that's a really critical point, because the space that I work in, where we talk to organizations about the power and impact mentoring can have on recruiting people into your organization, not only recruiting them in, but keeping them and upskilling them and advancing them, that mentoring is such a powerful tool. And we know that the most effective mentoring relationships often happen with people who share identity. However, we know that many communities are not represented in higher positions within organizations. And then often when people are, they are very taxed with being the only one.
Yeah.
Being the only one in and of itself is taxing.
Yes. Yes.
And then those people often, because they are the only one, get asked to do a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
And this mentoring, which is so important and so invaluable for both mentor and mentee, some may be ready and willing, and others may not really have the bandwidth to be an effective mentor, depending upon what other things are on their plate. And so even though we may start with the best of intentions to want to match on those critical elements, I think one of the things that you articulate in your chapter that I want to give you an opportunity to talk about is that not only could it potentially be taxing, but there also may be pathways and networks and relationships that they themselves have not been able to cultivate to really provide the full breadth of access and networks and pathways for a mentee.
Yes, and so you're identifying how when you dig deep into the matching process, it's not as simple as it may seem, as it may seem on the surface. And I think part of this, and again, I'm going to stay within the university setting. Part of this is why it's so important that this culture of mentoring, okay, if we're going to emphasize this, then we need to reward it. And we need to acknowledge it, and we need to use it, say, in promotion materials, if not to the same extent as teaching and research, maybe hopefully close, so that a person that you described that may be in this underrepresented group may be able to take more of this on because they may have more of a demand on them, but it doesn't hurt them. In fact, hopefully within this culture, it can help them. And it's viewed as this person that brings this very desirable skill set and is meeting these needs of whether they're students, whether they're new employees, whatever the case may be. Tamara, so we're talking about, I want to talk about, we talked about these challenges. There's really good support too, though, that you can go outside of identities and still have these incredible mentoring experiences. And in some cases, that may allow the mentee more of an opportunity to network with people that may not be in somebody else's network. But as you look at that, I just want to share three things that I think are really important. So I'm going to look down at my paper here. Shared beliefs, values, and interests. And so I want to put that, but then I also they also understand power dynamics. And so when you bring all of these things together, you do have this opportunity for mentoring to be a rich experience, even though some important identities may not be matched. But when this mentor is aware of this, and then remember, one of the characteristics we emphasized was empathetic and listener. And then as they employ these skills, and maybe they're doing them with somebody that's a different, say, race than the mentor, you can create this environment where there's these shared interests, these shared values, these shared beliefs, and it can become this wonderful mentoring relationship. So those things are hard to quantify, Tamara. They're hard to
Yeah.
put on a spreadsheet and in an algorithm. And I think the WISE program coordinator or committee that's working on these matching, they have to bring in kind of their gut feeling, and they're like, at the end of the day, I think this match would really work out because
Yeah.
of these, because of these characteristics that we've described. And I think through that, the mentee creates this safe place for this mentor to thrive, to reach their full potential. And I think that's ultimately what we're striving for in mentoring programs, Tamara. And so those are kind of the highlights of the matching process that I think are important to emphasize, and how to try to address them when maybe the matches that may be easier to identify, like, race or interest or things like that, when they don't line up perfectly or there's challenges with them, how do we move this forward in a way that helps the mentee?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think, mentoring is so powerful, and depending upon our why, that's going to also inform the matching and what is going to be most critical. And then when we think about, what are resources and what's available, and I think whether there are mentoring relationships where there's a shared identity factor, or whether they're cross-cultural, that empathy and understanding the experience of the other and being curious to understand the experience of the other is what really builds, creates the groundwork or the foundations for building a strong and impactful mentoring relationship. Because, we know that whether it's in higher ed or in the private sector, in order for the demands to be met, people are going to have to mentor across difference and being able to navigate that. And I know Lisa Fain's work and her chapter certainly talks about that, as well as Dion Clava's chapter. And there's some really great chapters that really hone in on the importance, as well as Azada Sarai's chapter with Nancy Lopez. Really great work around the level of empathy and understanding of the other's experience being so fundamental to a successful mentoring relationship.
And Tamara, I really appreciate you emphasizing that. And I really want to highlight the words you use, being curious. That wasn't that's not a word I used. So I really appreciate you bringing it up, because I think when that curiosity then is mixed with empathy and all of these positive characteristics, it does create this wonderful, safe place for this mentoring relationship to thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dave, we could probably keep this conversation going for another couple hours and still not even tap into the wealth of information that you have provided. But before we go, I've been asking folks, and I want to make sure that I ask you, as we've got program coordinators thinking about recruiting, selecting, and matching. What is something that is going to be a must-have? I think we know the answer to this, but what is something that's going to be a must-have for their recruiting, selection, and matching processes?
I think a must-have is personal contact. I would say that's the critical step in the selection process, is always having that personal contact. So that's what I would say is a must-have.
Great. And now we've got program coordinators listening, and maybe they can't have everything, but what would be a nice to have?
I think a nice to have would be this kind of a matrix for that you would start to use. Just keep it simple at first, of what you're going to do to match your people. Let me just give you an example. For example, here in the Uinta Basin, when we started, we matched them on their major and whether they were in one town or another town. And that was simple.
Yeah.
That was where we started. We've evolved since then,
Right.
but it was nice to have that, and it gave us
Yeah.
a ground place to start.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic, right? Keeping it simple. Don't
Keep it
overcomplicate it
simple.
if you don't need to. And what is something that people can do without? Don't say technology, but what what's guiding your answer any more than not say technology? What can people live without?
I would say I would say I'm going to say there's great programs out there that can help with the matching process, and I want to advocate for those tomorrow, but you probably don't need you don't need to have those up front to get started.
Correct. Yeah.
It would be nice to have down the road, but when you're just getting started, you can still move forward with your program.
Yeah.
And then keep your eye on that for the future.
That's terrific. Well, thank you, Dave, so much. I have again enjoyed having this conversation with you. I want to make sure that people really dig into Chapter 9. It's going to be pivotal to this process along with the other content. And be sure to catch Dave and I in our editor's conversation with Dave Law and his co-editor, Nora Dominguez. And until then, we will see you all in our next episode.